Look at the great Samson now. He can't even move the pillars. Where is your strength now?
His hands were chained to stone. The crowd above him was roaring. Thousands of voices laughing, jeering, calling out his name, not to honor him, but to humiliate him. The most powerful man who had ever lived was standing in the dark, blind, broken, and bound, performing tricks for his enemies. And in that moment, not a single person in that arena believed he was a threat. Not a single guard reached for a weapon. Not a single lord of Philistia was afraid, because they had already taken everything from him: his strength, his dignity, his eyes. They thought they had taken God from him too. They were wrong. Before we go any further, right now, in these opening seconds, I need you to understand something. What you are about to watch is not a children's story. It is not a simple moral lesson dressed up in ancient clothes. The story of Samson is one of the most raw, psychologically complex, and deeply human narratives in all of recorded history. It is a story about a man chosen by God before he was even conceived, a man visited by angels, consecrated before birth, and gifted with power no human being had ever possessed. And it is a story about how that same man spent his entire life walking toward his own destruction, one reckless choice at a time. But here is what makes it extraordinary. At the very bottom of everything, when the gifts were gone and the strength had left and the eyes had been gouged out, God had not. That is the story we are telling today. And I promise you, if you stay with us through every chapter of this documentary, you will not just learn about an ancient judge named Samson. You will see yourself in him. You will recognize his patterns. You will feel the weight of his choices. And you will walk away asking questions about strength and weakness and purpose and grace that you have probably never asked before. Stay with us. This one matters. How does a man chosen by God before birth end up a prisoner, blinded by his enemies, performing tricks for their amusement? That is the question. And the answer will change the way you read this story forever. There are three questions at the center of this story. Three questions that scholars have wrestled with for thousands of years, that theologians have debated in universities and seminaries, and that ordinary people, people just like you, have quietly asked themselves when they read these 4 chapters of the book of Judges. The first question is this: why would a man supernaturally gifted by God repeatedly turn toward the very people God called him to oppose? Why did Samson keep going back to the Philistines, not to fight them, but to love them, to eat with them, to sleep in their beds? What does it mean when the weapon God forged keeps gravitating toward the enemy's camp? That is the first question. The second question is about a woman named Delilah. Because 3,000 years after she appears in these pages, we still do not fully understand her. Was she a calculating instrument of the Philistine state? A spy placed in Samson's path from the very beginning? Or was she something more complicated than that? Did she love him? Is it possible to love someone and still choose to destroy them? And if so, what does that say about the nature of love itself? Scholars have wrestled with Delilah for centuries, and we are going to wrestle with her too, because the answer matters. And the third question, perhaps the most important of all, is about the final moment. When Samson stood between those 2 pillars, blind and in chains, and pushed with everything he had left, and brought the entire temple crashing down on 3,000 people, including himself. Was that an act of faith? Was it revenge? Was it redemption? Was it all 3 at once? And why, after a lifetime of broken vows and selfish choices and wasted potential, does the writer of the New Testament book of Hebrews include Samson's name in the Hall of Faith? Those are our questions, and every single one of them will be answered before this documentary is done.
To understand Samson, you first have to understand the world that produced him. And that world was a world under occupation. It is approximately 1,100 years before the birth of Christ. The ancient land of Canaan, the territory that God had promised to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is a fractured, contested, and deeply troubled place. The Israelites have been in the land for generations now, but they have never fully claimed it. They have never fully united. And in the hill country of what would one day become the tribe of Dan, on the southwestern edge of Israelite territory, lies a narrow, contested valley that would become the backdrop for one of the most dramatic lives in all of human history. It is called the Valley of Sorek. On the Sorek Valley is a natural corridor that runs from the central highlands of Judah westward to the Mediterranean coast, and for as long as anyone could remember, it had been a border zone, the kind of place where two worlds collide and neither one wins. To the east, in the hills, were the Israelites clinging to their covenant faith and their tribal identity. And to the west, on the rich coastal plain, were the Philistines. Now the Philistines are one of the most misunderstood peoples in all of ancient history. We have been using the word Philistine for centuries as an insult, a word for someone who is crude, ignorant, uncivilized. But the real Philistines were none of those things. Archaeologists have excavated their cities extensively. At Tel Batash, the ancient site of the city of Timnah, which figures directly into the Samson story, researchers have uncovered sophisticated architecture, finely decorated pottery, conical stamp seals, and evidence of a literate, organized, militarized society. The Philistines had arrived in Canaan sometime around 1200 BCE, most likely from the Aegean world, possibly from the island of Crete, or the broader region of what the ancient texts call the Sea Peoples. They brought with them iron technology at a time when most of the surrounding cultures were still working in bronze. They established 5 major city-states along the coast: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. Each was ruled by a lord, a Sorek in their own language. And together, these 5 lords formed a kind of governing council that coordinated Philistine policy toward the Israelites. And their policy, on for the 4 decades immediately before Samson's birth, was domination. According to the book of Judges, Israel had been under Philistine oppression for 40 years. 40 years. An entire generation had grown up knowing nothing but Philistine rule. That is the world into which a man named Manoah and his wife were living in the village of Zorah, in the hill country of the tribe of Dan. And into that world, something was about to happen that would change everything. The text of the book of Judges tells us that Manoah's wife was barren. She had been unable to conceive a child. In the ancient world, barrenness was not simply a medical condition. It was a source of profound social shame, of spiritual anguish, of questions that had no easy answers. And yet, into the quiet grief of this unnamed woman's life, one day, without warning, something extraordinary occurred. An angel appeared. The text of Judges chapter 13 records it this way: An angel of the Lord appeared to the woman and said to her, "You are sterile and childless, but you are going to conceive and give birth to a son." Notice something immediately. The angel did not appear to Manoah, the husband. The angel appeared to the wife, the woman whose name the Bible never records. She is known only as Manoah's wife throughout the entire narrative, is the first person entrusted with this divine announcement. She is the first to receive the promise. And what the angel told her was remarkable. She would conceive and bear a son. But this son would be no ordinary child. He was to be set apart for God from the moment of his birth, a Nazirite, consecrated to the Lord from the womb. Now, in the Nazirite vow was a specific practice in ancient Israelite religion, and understanding it is absolutely essential to understanding everything that happens in the Samson story. The word Nazirite comes from the Hebrew word Nazir, which means to be set apart, to be consecrated, to be dedicated. A person who took a Nazirite vow was committing themselves to a specific set of restrictions as an outward expression of their total dedication to God. According to the rules laid out in the 6th chapter of the book of Numbers, a Nazirite was forbidden from drinking wine or any other fermented drink, or even from eating anything derived from grapes, raisins, grape juice, vinegar. A Nazirite was forbidden from cutting their hair for the duration of the vow, and a Nazirite was forbidden from going near a dead body, whether human or animal, because contact with death made a person ritually unclean. These 3 restrictions, no wine, no razor, no contact with the dead, were the visible signs of a person wholly set apart for God. Most people who took the Nazirite vow did so voluntarily, for a fixed period of time. But Samson's situation was different in a way that made it unlike any other Nazirite in the entire Bible. Samson had not chosen this consecration. His parents had not chosen it on his behalf. God himself had appointed it before Samson was even conceived, while he was still a promise rather than a person. He was to be a Nazirite from the womb until the day of his death. His entire life was to be lived as a walking, breathing, living symbol of total dedication to God. And the reason was this: as the angel told Manoah's wife, he will begin the deliverance of Israel from the hands of the Philistines. This child, not yet born, was already assigned a mission. He was a weapon being forged in a womb. When Manoah's wife ran to tell her husband what had happened, Manoah did what many of us would do in that situation. He needed to verify it himself. He prayed and asked God to send the man of God again. The angel returned, and once again appeared to the wife first. She ran to get her husband. Manoah came and spoke with the angel, asking what rules should govern the child's upbringing. The angel repeated the instructions. Then Manoah offered to prepare a young goat as hospitality, a gesture of gratitude. The angel declined to eat, but told them to offer the animal as a burnt offering to God. When Manoah asked the angel's name, the angel replied that his name was beyond understanding. Literally, in the Hebrew, it is wonderful. And when Manoah prepared the offering and the flame rose from the altar, the angel ascended in the fire, and they fell on their faces to the ground. Manoah was terrified. He told his wife, "We are doomed to die. We have seen God." But his wife responded with extraordinary composure. If God intended to kill them, she said, God would not have accepted their offering, would not have shown them such things, would not have made this promise. In time, the woman conceived and gave birth to a son, and she named him Samson, the Hebrew name Shimshon, which most scholars connect to the word Shemesh, meaning sun, carries within it a kind of radiance, a brightness. And the boy who was called to be God's instrument of light against the darkness of Philistine oppression was given a name that means something like man of the sun. And as he grew up, the text records something that is easy to read past, but is actually profound. The Lord blessed him. And the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him in a place called Mahane Dan, between Zorah and Eshtaol, the very same territory where he would one day be buried, the land where his story both began and ended. He was born into a world at war, consecrated before he drew his first breath, named for the sun, stirred by the Spirit of God in the hills between two worlds. Everything was in place. Every gift had been given. The only question was what he would do with them. And the answer to that question is the most complicated, painful, and ultimately hopeful story in the entire book of Judges. Samson grew up on the edge, and I mean that both literally and figuratively. Literally, he grew up in Zorah, a village perched at the border between Israelite and Philistine territory, close enough to see the Philistine world, far enough to remember he was not of it. Figuratively, he grew up at the edge of something enormous, a calling, a destiny, a power that moved inside him like a current he could feel but could not always explain. Scholars who have studied the Samson narrative closely, commentators like Barry Webb in the New International Commentary on the Old Testament and Tremper Longman in his Old Testament survey, note something interesting about the text's description of Samson's early life. The Bible tells us that the Spirit of God stirred him, and the Hebrew word used is pam, a word that means to thrust, to impel, to drive, like a hammer striking an anvil. This was not a gentle spiritual nudging. Something in Samson was kinetic from the very beginning. What did he look like? Here is one of the most fascinating questions in the entire narrative. The text of Judges never once describes Samson as physically imposing. It never says he was tall or broad-shouldered or visibly muscular. This is significant because when the other characters in the story encounter his strength, they are consistently baffled by it. Where does this come from? How can this man do these things? The Philistines' inability to understand the source of his power drives the entire second half of the story. Biblical scholars like David Guzik have noted that Samson likely did not look the way centuries of paintings and Hollywood films have portrayed him, a towering, muscle-bound giant. The strength was not in his body. It was in his covenant. It was in the Spirit that rushed upon him in moments of crisis and need. Which means that on any given ordinary day, Samson probably looked like someone you could underestimate. And that underestimation, in both directions, the Philistines underestimating him, and perhaps Samson underestimating the true source of his own power, runs like a thread through this entire story. What we do know about Samson's character as a young man is this: he was impulsive, he was proud, he was easily attracted, he was prone to acting alone, and he had a gift for letting personal grievances escalate into catastrophic violence. These are not flattering qualities, and the scholars who study this text are remarkably honest about them. One commentary puts it this way: Samson is not the moral center of this story, he is the center of the story, full stop. His character flaws are not hidden or softened by the narrative. They are front and center, treated with a kind of unflinching honesty that should give every reader pause. Because Samson is not presented as an exception. He is presented as a mirror, a man whose greatest gifts became the arena in which his deepest flaws played out. And for anyone watching this documentary who has ever had the uncomfortable experience of watching their own life unfold in a way that didn't match their potential, that recognition is exactly what the text is designed to produce. Before we go any further into the full story, I want to pause here and set the stage one more time, because what you need to hold in your mind as we walk through these events is a very specific tension. On one side of that tension, God has chosen this man, appointed him, gifted him, consecrated him from the womb, sent an angel to announce his birth, stirred his spirit from childhood. God's hand is undeniably on Samson's life, and on the other side of that tension, Samson is going to make almost every wrong choice available to him. He is going to break his vows. He is going to trust the wrong people, as he is going to let his appetites lead him into the heart of enemy territory again and again. And yet, and this is the part that makes this story theologically staggering, God is going to use him anyway. God is going to work through every single failure, every broken covenant, every reckless act of personal vengeance, and use it to accomplish the very purpose for which Samson was born, the deliverance of Israel from the Philistines, not the way anyone planned it, Not the way Samson intended it, but the deliverance nonetheless. Now let us go to Timnah, because it is in Timnah that the story truly begins. And what starts there with a glance across a crowded marketplace will end, years later, in a blinded man's hands braced against two stone pillars in the dark. The 14th chapter of Judges opens with a journey. Samson goes down to Timnah. That word, down, is geographically accurate. Timnah sits in the lowlands of the Sorek Valley, below the hill country where Samson grew up. Archaeologists have confirmed the site of ancient Timnah at a location known today as todayThis, in the Sorek Valley about 7 kilometers west of Beth Shemesh. Excavations at this site, conducted over 12 seasons beginning in 1977 under the direction of archaeologists Amihai Mazar of Hebrew University and George Kelm of Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, uncovered layers of Philistine occupation from the Iron Age period that corresponds precisely to the era of Samson. They found sophisticated Philistine pottery decorated with geometric patterns, stamp seals indicating literacy, dense mud brick architecture, and evidence of a well-organized, thriving city. And the Philistine city of Timnah was not a crude outpost. It was a real, substantial, cosmopolitan place. And Samson walked into it. And there, in Timnah, he saw a woman, a Philistine woman. And the text records his response with remarkable directness. He came back to his father and mother and said, "I have seen a Philistine woman in Timnah. Now get her for me as my wife." Just like that, no deliberation, no spiritual consultation, no wrestling with what this might mean for his Nazirite calling, his covenant identity, or his divinely appointed mission. He saw her. He wanted her. He said, "Get her for me." His parents were horrified. They asked him what millions of parents throughout history have asked a child who is making a terrible decision. Is there not a woman among the daughters of your relatives or among all our people that you must go to take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? But Samson said to his father, "Get her for me, for she is right in my eyes." Right in my eyes. That phrase in the Hebrew carries enormous weight. The entire book of Judges is haunted by its variant. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. It is the diagnosis of an era. And here is Samson, God's consecrated judge, the one person in this generation who was supposed to be different, choosing the very same posture. What happens next is one of the most theologically layered passages in all of Judges. The text says, and listen carefully to this, because it is easy to miss. His father and mother did not know that this was from the Lord, for he was seeking an occasion against the Philistines. Read that again. God was in this. God was using Samson's impulsive, or arguably disobedient desire for a Philistine woman as a catalyst for the very conflict he intended to ignite. This is not God endorsing what Samson did. The text is very careful not to say that. But it is God, in his sovereignty, in his capacity to work through broken human choices, using this situation for purposes that Samson himself did not understand and was not even thinking about. It is the same dynamic we see again and again throughout the Bible. What human beings intend for one thing, God routes towards something else entirely. The scholar Ken Matthews, in his commentary on Judges, calls this a pattern of gracious providential governance, God steering history through the very failures of his instruments, rather than despite them. Keep that in mind, because it becomes the master key for understanding everything that follows. Samson and his parents went down to Timnah together. On the road, near the vineyards of Timnah, Samson left his parents and went on ahead alone. And that is when a young lion came roaring toward him. The text describes what happened next with the same quiet matter-of-factness it uses for everything in this story. the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon Samson powerfully, and he tore the lion apart with his bare hands, as one tears a young goat, the text's phrase, though he had nothing in his hand. He told no one what had happened, not his mother, not his father. He went on down, spoke with the Philistine woman, and found that she pleased him. Later, days or weeks after the encounter, he came back through that same road and turned aside to look at the carcass of the lion, and something stopped him. Inside the lion's body, a swarm of bees had nested, and they had made honey. Samson reached into the carcass of the dead animal and scooped the honey out with his hands and ate it. Then he brought some to his parents and gave it to them, and they ate it too. He said nothing about where it came from. Now here is where it gets complicated. Samson had just violated his Nazirite vow twice. Touching the dead carcass of an animal was explicitly forbidden by the law of the Nazirite in Numbers chapter 6. And the honey he took from inside that carcass, the honey he gave to his parents, who ate it unknowingly, that too came from contact with death. These are not minor technicalities. The Nazirite vow was not a set of optional guidelines. It was the outward expression of Samson's entire identity as a person set apart for God, and he had broken it, quietly, as almost casually, and told no one. This pattern, the private transgression, the hidden compromise, the secret kept from the people who loved him most, this pattern is going to become the defining rhythm of Samson's life. The wedding feast was held at Timnah. The Hebrew word used for the feast is mishteh, a word associated specifically with drinking celebrations. 30 Philistine companions were assigned to Samson for the occasion, as was the custom. And Samson, confident in his own cleverness, issued a challenge. "Let me tell you a riddle," he said. "If you can give me the answer within the 7 days of the feast, I will give you 30 linen garments and 30 festal garments. But if you cannot tell me the answer, you shall give me 30 linen garments and 30 festal garments." They agreed. And Samson posed his riddle. Out of the eater came something to eat. Out of the strong came something sweet. He was referring to the lion and the honey. The only two people who could possibly have known the answer were Samson himself and the lion. His riddle was unbreakable, or so he thought. For 3 days the 30 Philistine men could not solve it. On the 4th day, they approached Samson's wife, the Philistine woman he had married, and threatened her. "Entice your husband to explain the riddle to us," they said, "or we will burn you and your father's household with fire." This was not a request. This was a death threat. Samson's wife was trapped between a man she had just married and a community that was threatening to kill her family. She wept before Samson for the remaining days of the feast, pressing him. "You hate me. You do not really love me. You have told my people a riddle, but have not told me the answer." Day after day, the pressure mounted, and on the 7th day he told her. She told the 30 men. And on the 7th day, before sundown, they came to Samson and said, "What is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion?" Samson looked at them, and he understood. He said, "If you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have found out my riddle." His wife, the woman he had walked to Timnah to claim, the woman his parents had warned him about, the woman whose smile had launched this entire chain of events, had betrayed him. And Samson's response was going to set the entire region on fire. The Spirit of the Lord rushed upon Samson. That phrase appears again and again in the Samson narrative, and every time it does, something devastating happens. Samson went down to Ashkelon, one of the 5 major Philistine cities, roughly 30 miles from Timnah. And he struck down 30 of their men, took their garments, and gave the 30 sets of clothes to the men who had solved the riddle. Then he returned to his father's house in burning anger. And while he was gone, his wife, the woman of Timnah, was given by her father to one of Samson's companions, the best man at his own wedding. When Samson cooled down and returned to Timnah sometime later, carrying a young goat as a peace offering, intending to visit his wife, her father stopped him at the door. "I was so sure you utterly hated her," the father said, "that I gave her to your companion. Is not her younger sister more beautiful than she? Please take her instead." And that was the moment. That was the moment when whatever restraint Samson still possessed dissolved entirely. He said words that the ancient world would have understood as a declaration of lawful retaliation. "This time I cannot be blamed for whatever I do to the Philistines." And then he went out and did one of the most bizarre, audacious, and operationally complex acts of sabotage in all of ancient warfare. He caught 300 foxes. 300. The text offers no explanation of how long this took or how it was accomplished. Scholars have debated whether these were foxes specifically, or perhaps jackals. The Hebrew word can be translated either way. But the point is not the species. The point is the number and the intent. He took these animals, tied them in pairs by their tails, fastened a burning torch between each pair of tails, and let them go into the standing grain of the Philistines. And it was harvest season. The grain was ripe and ready, the driest time of the year in the Near Eastern agricultural calendar. The foxes ran in terror through the fields, and the fire followed wherever they went. The grain fields burned, the vineyards burned, the olive orchards burned. An entire harvest, the economic lifeblood of the region, was consumed in a single night. When the Philistines found out who had done it and why, they did not go after Samson first. They went after his wife and her father, and they burned them to death, which meant that the very thing Samson's wife had feared, the threat the 30 Philistine men had used to coerce her into betraying the riddle, had come to pass anyway. She had given them what they wanted to save her family, and her family burned regardless. When Samson learned what had happened, he said, "Since you acted like this, I swear that I will not rest until I have taken revenge on you." And he struck them down hip and thigh with a great slaughter. The language there, hip and thigh, is an idiom in ancient Hebrew that means a comprehensive, thorough defeat. He then went down and took up residence in a cave in the rock of Etam. The Philistines mobilized. They came into Judah and spread out at a place called Lehi. And when the men of Judah, Samson's own countrymen, asked why they had come, the Philistines said, "We have come to take Samson prisoner, to do to him as he did to us." And here is one of the most psychologically devastating details in the entire story. 3,000 men of Judah came down to the cave at Etam to find Samson. The 3,000 Israelites. They were not coming to fight with him. They were coming to hand him over. They said to him, "Do you not know that the Philistines are rulers over us? What is this you have done to us?" And Samson said, "As they did to me, so have I done to them." The men of Judah said they had come to bind him and give him to the Philistines. Samson made only one request, that they themselves would not strike him. They agreed. They bound him with 2 new ropes and brought him up from the rock. When they arrived at Lehi, the Philistines came shouting toward him, and the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon Samson powerfully. The ropes that bound his arms became like charred flax, and the bindings fell from his hands. He looked down. There on the ground was a fresh jawbone of a donkey. an animal carcass, on technically another violation of the Nazirite purity code, but Samson reached for it without hesitation. He picked it up, and with the jawbone of a donkey, he struck down 1,000 Philistine men. 1,000. When it was over, Samson threw the jawbone away and named the place Ramath-lehem, Hill of the Jawbone. And then, almost immediately, in the very next breath of the text, Samson was desperately thirsty. He cried out to God. "You have given this great salvation by the hand of your servant," he said, "and now shall I die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised." It is his first recorded prayer in the narrative, and it is honest and raw and slightly unbeautiful. He is not thanking God with eloquence. He is telling God that the victory God just gave him means nothing if he dies of thirst in the next 5 minutes. He is needy, exhausted, and direct. And God answered. God split open a hollow place, and water came out of it, and Samson drank. The text says his spirit returned, and he was revived. He named the place Ein Hakore, the spring of the one who called. He judged Israel for 20 years in the days of the Philistines, 20 years of judging, 20 years of being the most feared man in the region, 20 years of operating at the edge of his calling, close enough to the Philistine world to feel its pull, far enough from his own people to be more alone than anyone around him ever realized. And then came the valley of Sorek, and a woman named Delilah. Before we go deeper into what happened in the valley of Sorek, we want to pause for just a moment and hear from you. This community means everything to us here at Fireside Bible Study, and we would love to know where you are watching from right now. Drop a comment below and let us know your city, your state, your country. Wherever you are in the world, we want to know you are here. And if this is your first time watching one of our documentaries, please hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. We go this deep into the story every single time. Now, back to Samson, back to the valley, back to the woman who would become the most famous name in this entire story. Between his 20 years of judging and the Delilah episode, the text of Judges chapter 16 gives us a brief but extraordinary scene that functions as a kind of prologue to everything that follows, a preview of both Samson's power and his vulnerability. Samson went to Gaza. Gaza was not neutral territory, or Gaza was one of the 5 great Philistine city-states, a major urban center, a stronghold of everything Samson was supposed to oppose. And he went there, according to the text, because he saw a prostitute there, and he went into her. This is not glossed over or softened by the biblical narrator. Samson, the consecrated Nazirite, the judge of Israel, the man whose calling was to oppose the Philistines, walked into the heart of their most powerful city for a night with a woman he was not married to, in the most flagrant violation of everything his identity was supposed to represent. The men of Gaza found out he was there. They surrounded the city gates, set an ambush, and planned to wait for morning light to seize him. But at midnight, in the darkest hour, when no one was watching, when no one was prepared, Samson rose, went to the gates of the city, and took hold of the 2 door posts in the bar. He pulled them up, posts and all, lifted the entire gate structure onto his shoulders, and carried it to the top of a hill facing Hebron. Hebron was not around the corner. Scholars estimate that the hill Samson carried the city gates to was some 40 miles from Gaza. The most powerful weapon God had placed in an entire generation carried city gates on his shoulders in the middle of the night for 40 miles, and then apparently went home. The text records this as if it is almost an afterthought, which, in the architecture of the narrative, it essentially is. Because this scene is not here to impress us, it is here to make a point. Samson in Gaza represents the central paradox of his life in its purest, most concentrated form, as he is simultaneously demonstrating the most extraordinary divine power available to any human being in his generation, and completely squandering the life God entrusted to him with that power. He should not have been in Gaza. He knew it. The carrying of the gates was not an act of mission or strategy or holy warfare. It was an escape from a situation he never should have been in. And the Philistines let him go, not because they were afraid, but because they had not yet found the right instrument to bring him down. That instrument was coming. She was waiting in a valley, and Samson was already walking toward her. After Gaza, Samson loved a woman in the valley of Sorek. Her name was Delilah, and that name has echoed through 3,000 years of human history as a synonym for betrayal. But who was she really? And was the story between them as simple as it has always seemed? Judges chapter 16, verse 4. After this he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. That sentence is deceptively simple. 4 things in it deserve our full attention. First, the word loved. The Hebrew word used here is ahev, a word for deep, genuine, relational love. Not infatuation, not lust. The same word used in other parts of the Hebrew Bible for the love between David and Jonathan, or the love of a parent for a child. Whatever Samson felt for Delilah, the text is using the strongest available word for human affection. Second, the valley of Sorek. This is the same valley where Samson grew up. This is border territory, Israelite and Philistine worlds pressing against each other. Delilah lived right in that contested middle space. Third, the name Delilah itself. Biblical scholars have noted that Delilah's name sounds remarkably like the Hebrew word Layla, meaning night, and carries connotations of darkness, mystery, and in some readings, vulnerability or flirtation. And fourth, her ethnicity. The text never actually identifies Delilah as a Philistine. It tells us she was in the valley of Sorek. It tells us the Philistine lords approached her. But it never explicitly says she was one of them. That ambiguity about Delilah's background has fascinated biblical scholars for centuries, and it matters more than it might seem. The Biblical Archaeology Review published a detailed analysis noting that Delilah is the only named woman in the entire Samson narrative. His mother, his Timnite wife, us and the prostitute in Gaza are all referred to without being named, and that the fact that she was given a name at all signals her importance to the narrative architecture. Scholar Tikva Freimer-Kensky has argued that Delilah's name, being Hebrew rather than Philistine in origin, suggests she may have been an Israelite woman living in contested territory, not a Philistine agent. Others, like John Gray in his commentary on Judges, have maintained that her close relationship with the Philistine lords makes her ethnic identity essentially irrelevant. Her allegiance, whatever her origin, was clearly not to Samson's people or Samson's God. Whatever her background, the Philistine lords found her. And they came to her with a proposition that was, in the ancient world, essentially an enormous fortune. 5 lords, each of them pledging 1,100 pieces of silver if she could discover the secret of Samson's strength. 5 times 1,100. 5,500 pieces of silver in total. To put that in context, the book of Exodus tells us that in the ancient world, the standard price for a slave was 30 pieces of silver. What the Philistine lords offered Delilah was equivalent to the purchase price of roughly 180 human beings. This was not a small incentive. This was a life-changing sum. The kind of money that could buy land, security, status, and independence for the rest of her life. The lords told her what they needed. Entice him, and see where his great strength lies, and by what means we may overpower him, that we may bind him to humble him. They were not asking her to love him less. And they were not asking her to hurt him herself. They were asking for information. One secret, the source of the power that had been destroying their armies and burning their fields for 20 years. And Delilah said yes. Now, I want to pause here, because this is where a great deal of popular imagination takes over and turns Delilah into a cartoon villain. A cold, calculating seductress with nothing but contempt for Samson in her heart. And the text does not actually give us that picture. What the text gives us is far more uncomfortable. It gives us a woman who loved a man, or at least a woman whom that man deeply loved, and who was offered enough money to secure her entire future in exchange for one piece of information. It gives us a woman who had to weigh, in whatever interior calculation she was capable of, what Samson was worth against what that money meant. That is not cartoonish. That is disturbingly human. And the fact that the text records Samson's love for her without ever confirming that she returned it is one of the most quietly devastating literary choices in the entire Bible. Delilah went to work. She said to Samson, "Please tell me where your great strength lies and how you might be bound, that one could subdue you." Now, stop. Read that again. She asked him directly, out loud, to his face. She did not trick him with cleverness. She did not seduce the answer out of him in a moment of vulnerability. She asked him plainly what the source of his power was and how he could be overpowered and bound. And Samson, the man who had been chosen before birth, stirred by the Spirit of God from childhood, as who had fought armies alone and carried city gates across the desert, Samson lied to her. He said, "If they bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings that have not been dried, I shall become weak and be like any other man." Delilah bound him with 7 fresh bowstrings. The Philistines were waiting, hidden in an inner room. She called out, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." And Samson snapped the bowstrings as easily as a thread of flax snaps when it comes near fire. Delilah's response is recorded without embellishment. "Behold, you have mocked me and told me lies. Please tell me how you might be bound." Second attempt. And again Samson lied. He said, "If they bind me with new ropes that have not been used, I shall become weak and be like any other man." New ropes. She bound him again. The Philistines were waiting again. She called out again. He snapped the ropes off his arms like thread. Third attempt. He told her to weave the 7 locks of his hair into the web of a loom and fasten it with a pin, and he would be helpless. She wove his hair into the loom while he slept and fastened it with a pin. She called out. He woke and pulled away, taking the pin and the loom and the web with him. 3 times, 3 attempts, 3 lies, 3 failures. 3 times, Samson woke up and found himself surrounded by Philistines and broke free without apparent difficulty. And every single time, he stayed. Why did he stay? That question is perhaps the deepest mystery in the entire Samson narrative. He knew she was trying to deliver him to his enemies. He had to know. The pattern was unmistakable. Every time he woke up, there were Philistines in the room. She was asking him the same question, over and over, in different forms. He was not naive. He was not stupid. He was the judge of Israel. And yet, he came back. Again and again. The scholar Robert Alter, in his landmark work, The Art of Biblical Narrative, suggests that Samson's behavior here reveals something essential about his psychology. A man who had always been invulnerable had become addicted to the feeling of almost losing, of being in danger and escaping it. He had been doing that his whole life, walking into enemy territory, getting in trouble, and walking out again. It had always worked before. And so he kept doing it. He kept returning to Delilah's house. He kept lying to her. And she kept pressing him. day after day. According to Judges chapter 16, verse 16, she pressed him hard with her words and urged him until his soul was vexed to death. That phrase, vexed to death. In Hebrew, the word translated vexed means shortened, compressed, suffocated. His soul was being suffocated, not his body, his soul. The weariness was not physical, it was existential. Something in Samson was exhausted, exhausted of lying, exhausted of the game, exhausted perhaps of a life lived in constant resistance to the very person he loved most. And so he told her. All of it. The truth. The real truth. And when he did, the entire trajectory of his life changed in a single, he told her all his heart. That is how the text describes it. Not that he answered her question. Not that he gave her information. He told her all his heart. Samson said to Delilah, "A razor has never come upon my head, for I have been a Nazirite to God from my mother's womb. If my head is shaved, my strength will leave me, and I shall become weak and be like any other man." In that moment, Samson did something he had never done before in the entire narrative. He was honest about everything, about who he was, what he carried, where the power came from, and what would happen if it was taken away. The man who had kept secrets from his parents, who had lied about the honey and the lion, who had given 3 different false answers to this very same woman. That man finally spoke the truth. Whether it was love or exhaustion, or the Spirit of God engineering a moment that would lead to a greater purpose than Samson could imagine, the text does not speculate. It simply records, he told her all his heart. Delilah knew immediately that he had told her the truth. The text says she saw that he had told her all his heart. She sent to the Philistine lords, "Come up this once, for he has told me all his heart." They came up to her, with the money in their hands. Then Delilah made Samson sleep on her knees. And while he slept, she called a man and had him shave off the 7 locks of Samson's hair. The text says she began to torment him, and his strength left him. Then she called out, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." And he woke from his sleep and said, "I will go out as before, and shake myself free." The text then records the most chilling line in the entire Samson narrative. 5 words in English that carry the weight of a tragedy 3,000 years old. He did not know that the Lord had left him. He did not know. He woke up ready to fight. He had done this 3 times already. He would break the ropes, shake himself free, send the Philistines running. He was Samson. He had been doing this for 20 years. He did not know that the Lord had left him. The hair was not a magic charm. Samson's power had never resided in the biology of his hair follicles. The hair was a symbol, a visible outward sign of a covenant relationship with God that had been, in its heart, crumbling for years. Every time Samson touched a dead animal, every time he ate from a carcass, every time he entered the house of a prostitute in an enemy city, every time he ignored the spiritual boundaries of his consecration, the covenant had been eroding. The hair was the last visible remnant of it, and now the hair was gone, and God was gone. And Samson had not felt the absence. He had not even noticed. Because the most devastating thing that can happen to a person who has drifted from God is not the moment God withdraws. It is the moment you reach for the power you used to have and find nothing. The Philistines seized him. They gouged out his eyes. They brought him down to Gaza, the same city where he had once carried the gates away in the middle of the night, and they bound him with bronze shackles and set him to grinding grain in the prison. Grinding grain was slave labor. It was work assigned to the lowest captives, to the most degraded, the most humiliated. The man who had once torn armies apart with a bone from the ground was now grinding in circles in the dark, doing the work of an animal, entertaining the lords and people of Philistia with his degradation. Everything had been stripped away, from the strength, the freedom, the dignity, the sight. Samson was in the lowest place a human being could reach. And in that place, the text records one more detail, not dramatic, not announced, not interpreted by the narrator. Just a fact, stated plainly in the middle of the darkness. But the hair of his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. In the dark of a Philistine prison, in the grinding routine of a slave, something was growing back. The Philistines were not watching for it. They did not think they needed to. They had already won. They had already taken everything. They had no idea what was coming. There is a kind of suffering that cannot be explained from the outside. The blindness, the chains, the grinding wheel going around and around in the dark, day after day. The laughter of guards who were once terrified of you. Be the silence of God where the rushing of the Spirit used to be. We do not have Samson's words from the prison. The book of Judges gives us no psalm of lament, no prayer record, no inner monologue from the cell at Gaza. It gives us only the silence and the growing hair. But the silence itself is part of the story. Because sometimes the most important thing that happens in a life happens in the absence of noise, in the absence of movement, in the place where a person has run out of options and run out of road and run out of the ability to pretend that they are still in control. Scholars who study the book of Judges in its literary context note that Samson's imprisonment echoes a pattern that runs through the entire Hebrew Bible, the pattern of the pit before the purpose. Joseph thrown into a cistern before he became the second most powerful man in Egypt. Moses fleeing to the desert before the burning bush. David hiding in caves before the throne. The prison of Gaza is not outside the biblical pattern. It is the pattern. The place of total stripping, total emptiness, total dependence is almost always the place that immediately precedes the most significant act of a person's divinely appointed life. This does not mean God is the author of the suffering. But it does mean that the God of the Bible has a long history of meeting people in their lowest places and doing his most consequential work precisely there, precisely then, precisely with the people who have the least left to offer. And here is what we know about the prison at Gaza from what the archaeology of this region tells us. That Gaza in the Iron Age was a major Philistine city, identified by archaeologists with a site called Tel Harube, at the highest point of modern Gaza City. The grinding mills used in Iron Age Philistine prisons were rotary or push-pull millstones, heavy basalt slabs designed to pulverize grain into flour. Working the mill was not just degrading, it was physically punishing, repetitive, monotonous labor. It was the kind of work that destroyed a person from the inside out, not through dramatic violence, but through the slow erosion of everything that made you feel human. Samson in that mill was a man being slowly erased, except that his hair was growing back, and with the hair, whether Samson knew it or not, the covenant was quietly, incrementally being restored. 20 years he had judged Israel. 20 years the Spirit of God had stirred in him, sometimes erupting in supernatural power, sometimes apparently dormant. And in all that time, through every broken vow, every act of revenge, every night in an enemy's bed, God had not given up on him. The prison was not God abandoning Samson. The prison was God waiting for the hair to grow, waiting for the pride to break, waiting for the man who had spent his entire life relying on his own power, even when that power was genuinely from God, to reach the place where he had nothing left but God himself. That place is the most important place in this story. It is the place where Hebrews chapter 11 makes its extraordinary claim, and we are going to get there. But first, we have to go to the Feast of Dagon. The Philistines were celebrating, and they had defeated their greatest enemy. Their God had delivered Samson into their hands. 3,000 people were gathering in the temple, and they wanted Samson brought out to entertain them. They had no idea they were walking into the most catastrophic moment in Philistine history. The lords of the Philistines gathered to offer a great sacrifice to their god Dagon and to celebrate. Dagon was one of the principal deities of the Philistine world, a god associated with grain and with the fertility of the earth, a god whose temples have been excavated at multiple sites in the ancient Levant. The temple at Gaza, where this final scene unfolds, has not survived to modern times, but archaeologists have excavated Philistine temples at other sites, including Tel Kazil near modern Tel Aviv and Tel Jemme near Gaza, that reveal a consistent architectural pattern. Philistine temples of this period were typically constructed with two central load-bearing wooden pillars set on stone bases, spaced close enough together that a man could reach both at once if his arms were extended. The entire weight of the roof and the crowd standing on it rested on those pillars. This architectural detail is not incidental. It is essential to everything that happens next. The people in the temple were calling out to one another, "Our God has given our enemy into our hand, the one who devastated our land and multiplied our slain." They were celebrating the end of a 20-year nightmare. Samson, the man who had burned their crops and killed their soldiers and escaped every trap they had ever laid, was finally in their possession, blind and chained. And the celebration was enormous. The text records that the lords of the Philistines were there, all 5 of them, and approximately 3,000 men and women were on the roof of the temple alone, watching and celebrating. This was not a small gathering. This was the entire leadership of Philistine civilization, gathered in one place to worship their God and mock their captive. When the hearts of the people were merry, when the celebration was at its height, they called for Samson to be brought out to perform for them. A boy led him by the hand. He was led into the temple, blinded and in chains, the most powerful man who had ever lived, now an object of entertainment and ridicule. And then Samson made one request of the boy who was leading him. "Let me feel the pillars on which the house rests," he said, "that I may lean against them." The boy brought him to the pillars. Samson reached out his hands. His right hand found one pillar. His left hand found the other. He stood in the dark with his hands on the 2 pillars that held up everything. And then he prayed. The prayer of Samson at the pillars is one of the most debated passages in all of Judges. It is recorded in verse 28. "O Lord God, please remember me, and please strengthen me only this once, O God, that I may be avenged on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." Read that carefully. This is not the prayer of a saint. It is not an eloquent confession or a refined theological petition. Samson is not asking God to deliver Israel or to vindicate his name or to accomplish the divine purpose for which Samson was born. He is asking God to let him get revenge for his eyes. That is the prayer. A revenge prayer from a blind man in chains, motivated by personal grievance, in what scholars across the theological spectrum agree is among the most morally ambiguous moments in the Old Testament. And God answered it. Why? Scholars like Tremper Longman and Barry Webb have wrestled seriously with this question, and the answer they arrive at is one of the most important theological insights in the entire book. God does not require perfect motives before he acts. God meets people where they are, even in the anger, even in the grief, even in the request for personal revenge from a man in a prison who had broken every vow he was supposed to keep. God was still there. What Samson said next was this: "Let me die with the Philistines." And he pushed, and with all his strength, more strength than he had possessed at any previous moment in the narrative, according to the text's own structure, he bowed himself with all his might and pushed the two central pillars of the temple. The pillars gave way. The roof came down. The walls collapsed. 3,000 people were killed, men and women, lords and commoners, everyone who was in the building and on the roof. The text records the devastation with a simple statement that is one of the most striking in all of Judges. So the dead whom he killed at his death were more than those he had killed during his life. The greatest act of Samson's life was the last act. The greatest deliverance he ever accomplished happened in the moment of his death. The man who had spent 20 years fighting Philistines one confrontation at a time, yet always on his own terms, always from his own strength, finally, in the moment of total surrender, accomplished more than all those years combined. The Temple of Dagon was rubble. The 5 lords of the Philistines were dead. The celebration had become a catastrophe. And Samson, the man born between Zorah and Eshtaol, consecrated from the womb, named for the sun, was gone. But his brothers came and took him and brought him back, and they buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol, the same place where the Spirit of the Lord first stirred him. He came home at the end, just not the way anyone imagined. There is a passage in the New Testament, in the book of Hebrews, in the 11th chapter, that has puzzled and challenged and inspired Bible readers for 2,000 years. It is the passage that Christians often call the Hall of Faith, a long, rolling recitation of men and women from the Hebrew Scriptures who are held up as examples of faith. And the writer of Hebrews, in verse 32, lists a series of names almost in passing: Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets. Samson, right there, in the middle of the list, alongside David, alongside the great prophets of Israel. Samson, the man who broke every vow he was supposed to keep. Samson, who spent 20 years in the Philistine world doing as he pleased. Samson, whose dying prayer was a request for personal revenge. That Samson is in the Hall of Faith. And the writer of Hebrews does not explain it, does not qualify it, does not footnote it. He just includes the name and moves on. How? How can this be? Well, the answer to that question is perhaps the most important theological contribution the Samson narrative makes to the entire Bible. Faith, as the book of Hebrews defines it in verse 1 of that same chapter, is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. It is not moral perfection. It is not an unblemished record. It is not the accumulation of spiritual achievements. It is trust in God, even when everything visible suggests that trust is unwarranted. And at the pillars of the Temple of Dagon, Samson prayed. He turned to God. In the dark, in the blindness, in the chains, with nothing left, he turned. He said, "Remember me." He said, "Strengthen me." He said, "Only this once." And that turning, however imperfect, however revenge-motivated, however late in the story it came, was faith, on the faith of a desperate man who had run out of everything else. The writer of Hebrews saw it, and God remembered it. Now let us step back from the narrative for a moment and look at what scholars have said about the historical question, because this is the kind of deep dive documentary that does not skip the archaeology or the scholarship. Was Samson a real historical figure? This is a question that has been seriously engaged by archaeologists and biblical historians. The world described in the Samson narrative has been extensively confirmed by excavation. The site of Timnah at todayThis, excavated over 12 seasons by Amihai Mazar and George Kelm, produced layers of Philistine occupation from the Iron Age that correspond precisely to the period when the Samson story is set, complete with sophisticated Philistine pottery, stamped seals, dense architecture, and evidence of a substantial, organized city on the western edge of the Sorek Valley. The valley itself, the Nahal Sorek, is exactly as described, a natural corridor between the Judean hills and the Philistine plain, still flowing today. The 5 Philistine city-states, Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath, have all been identified and partially excavated, confirming the political structure the Book of Judges describes. The world of Samson is not a mythological landscape. It is a real place with real soil and real archaeology. And yet there are scholars who argue that Samson's story carries the fingerprints of ancient Near Eastern mythology. Comparisons to the Greek hero Hercules are frequent in academic literature. Both Samson and Hercules were men of supernatural strength. Both killed lions. Both were undone by women they loved. Both performed seemingly impossible feats of physical power. Wikipedia and scholarly literature both note this comparison as a subject of ongoing debate. But the scholars who take the historicity of Samson seriously, including Kenneth Kitchen, whose archaeological and historical work on the ancient Near East is among the most respected in the field, argue that these parallels reflect the cultural idiom of the ancient world, not borrowed mythology. Heroic literature across cultures shares common motifs precisely because human beings across cultures share common experiences: the strong man, the fatal attraction, the tragic fall. That Samson's story echoes these universal patterns does not make it fiction. It makes it resonant. What we can say with confidence, based on the text, the archaeology, and the scholarly consensus, is this: the Book of Judges presents Samson as a historical figure, a judge of Israel from the tribe of Dan, who lived in the hill country of the Sorek Valley, who was consecrated as a Nazirite from birth, who fought the Philistines over a 20-year period, and who died in the destruction of a temple in Gaza. The specificity of the narrative, the named villages, the named valleys, the specific architecture, the specific customs, the specific political structures. All of this points to a historical tradition rather than a literary invention. Samson was real. The choices he made were real. The consequences were real. And the grace that found him at the end, in a prison in Gaza with nothing left and growing hair, was real too. So what does this story mean for us? Right now, today, under 3,000 years later? What does a blind man in chains in an ancient Philistine prison have to say to someone watching this documentary in a living room in America in the 21st century? Everything. He has everything to say. And we are going to spend the final section of this documentary unpacking exactly what. The story of Samson is not a story about what happens when you are too weak. It is a story about what happens when you are too strong for your own good. Samson never lacked power. He never lacked gifts. He never lacked opportunity. He was given, before he drew his first breath, everything he would have needed to be the greatest judge Israel ever produced. And he spent most of his life letting those gifts carry him into places they were never designed to carry him, making decisions that gratified the moment without regard for the mission, and trusting in the strength God had given him rather than in the God who had given the strength. That is not a problem unique to the 12th century before Christ. That is a problem that is absolutely alive today. The person who has been given enormous talent and lets it become an excuse for accountability. The man or woman who was raised in faith but has slowly drifted from it, one comfortable compromise at a time, without quite noticing the distance growing. The person who finds themselves in a place they never intended to be, looking back at the road and wondering how the gap between where they started and where they ended up got so wide. If that is you, and I suspect, watching this, I doubt that some part of this story has found something in you. Then I want you to hear what the story of Samson says to that person. It says that the gap between who you were called to be and who you have actually been is not the final word. It says that the things God built into you before you were born are not canceled by the choices you have made since. It says that prison, in whatever form it takes in your life, the prison of regret, the prison of consequences, the prison of a situation that feels like it has stripped away everything you used to rely on, that prison is not the end. The hair grows back, not metaphorically, not sentimentally. In the economy of God, the covenant capacity that has been neglected and covered and compromised begins quietly, in the dark, to grow again.
The temple down.
And it grows toward a moment of decision, a moment of turning, a moment of a prayer that is not elegant or theologically refined, but is honest and desperate and real. Remember me, strengthen me, just this once. The story of Samson is also a story for those of you who love someone like Samson, someone with extraordinary gifts who keeps choosing destruction, someone you have watched make the same choices over and over with the same results, and you have stayed and you have prayed, and you have wondered if God sees what you see. The story says, God saw. God was not absent from the grinding mill at Gaza. God was not indifferent to the broken vows and the burning fields and the wasted years. God was there, not endorsing the choices, not pretending the consequences away, but there, waiting, working, growing something back in the dark that the person themselves could not see. Hold on to that. And finally, for those of you who came to this story wondering about Delilah, wondering about the people in your own life who have seemed to hold that power, who have known exactly where you were vulnerable, and used that knowledge in ways that cost you dearly. The story of Samson says this: being betrayed by someone you loved does not disqualify you from your calling. It does not define the end of your story. The betrayal was real. The damage was real. But it was not the last chapter. The last chapter was written at the pillars. The last chapter was written in the prayer. The last chapter was written in the words of the New Testament writer, who looked at the entire wreckage of Samson's life and still found in it the signature of faith. Imperfect, desperate, last-minute faith, but faith nonetheless. And included his name in the company of the great. Samson was buried between Zorah and Eshtaol, the same hills where the Spirit of the Lord first stirred him as a boy, the same valley where his story began. His brothers came for him. His father's household came for him. Even at the end, after everything, there was a family to bring him home. He was buried in the place where God first touched him. And if that is not a statement about the mercy of God, that a man whose life looked, from the outside, like one long monument to wasted potential, would be brought home and laid to rest in the exact spot where his calling first began. I do not know what is. The book of Judges says that Samson judged Israel for 20 years in the days of the Philistines. 20 years. A generation. He was not the judge Israel deserved. He was not even, like in most ways, the judge Israel needed. He was a deeply flawed human being who kept choosing his own way over God's way, who let his passions lead him into the heart of the enemy's territory again and again, and who finally, at the last possible moment, found a kind of broken, authentic, rage-filled faith that God honored in the most devastating and consequential act of his life. That is his legacy, not the lion, not the foxes, not the Jawbone or the city gates or the 20 years of fighting. His legacy is a blind man in a prison with growing hair who still turned toward God when there was nothing left. I want to leave you with a question, not a theological question, not a historical question, not a question about the archaeology of Timnah or the identity of Delilah. A personal question. It is the question that the story of Samson has always been asking from the moment it was first told. And it is this: what is growing back in the dark places of your own life right now? What is God doing in the places you cannot see, in the waiting, in the silence, in the thing you gave up on? Because if the story of Samson teaches us anything, it is that God never stopped. God never stopped working, even in the prison, even in the blindness, even in the grinding of the mill. Something was growing, and what was growing was not just hair. It was the possibility of one last moment that would mean more than all the years that came before it. That possibility exists for every person watching this documentary right now. Do not miss it.